Okay, this is just a video explaining the context of The Quiet American, so you can rewatch this back as many times as you need when you are making your timeline. Okay, so we start off. Vietnam is a French colony. It is colonized between the French Empire between 1883 and 1888. And as you can see from this map here, we have British colonies in nowadays Burma, you have and Malaysia, you have the French in Cambodia and parts of Laos. And like most European colonial powers, the French treat the indigenous Vietnamese as second-class citizens. And generally, the French are pretty detested as rulers, as most of the European colonies are. And obviously, the name is French Indochina because it was sort of between India and China. So that is why it is known as Indochina in various parts of the Quiet American. And then obviously you have World War II, and during World War II, Japan declares war on Britain, France, Netherlands, and the USA. And Japan very quickly conquers many of the West's Asian colonies. And so for many of the Asian countries, this sort of dispels the myth of Western superiority. And you can see that at their height, they expand obviously into Manchuria and China and Hong Kong. They expand into Indochina, which is what we call Vietnam, Burma, Thailand, into Malaysia. They capture Singapore. They obviously capture large parts of Indonesia, the Solomon Islands. And this really dispels the myth of Western superiority. The fact that this other Asian country, Japan, has come along and has defeated the European and American powers so easily. However, it's not necessarily a good thing being conquered by the Japanese. In 1940, after France surrenders to Germany, the French moves troops into French Indochina and basically rule Vietnam from 1940 onwards. And one of the things Japan claimed during the Second World War is that it was building the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, sort of an Asian empire. That Asia would unite against Western colonists and America. And it sounded very good, and Japan had a lot of support initially. But as was the case in nearly every country that Japan colonized during World War II, including obviously Korea and China and Indonesia, Japanese occupation was often much worse than being ruled by the British or the French or the Americans. The Vietnamese famine of 1945 was caused largely by the Japanese's actions. So when the Japanese surrendered to the Allies in August 1945, many of the Asian colonies proclaim independence, which is why Vietnam declares independence, Indonesia declares independence. And this was because it seemed a good time to do it, and because they had seen that Asian armies could defeat Western armies, because the Japanese had done it. And the Viet Minh, which was a communist-inspired movement led by Ho Chi Minh, during World War II, he had been supported by the Americans because he was fighting the Japanese. Proclaimed Vietnamese independence on September the 2nd, 1945. So World War II ends, Vietnam says, no, we are independent now. Now, of course, the French, their national pride and their reputation had been badly damaged by World War II because they surrendered to the Germans so quickly. So they send out troops to retake Indochina, and it's quite similar to how the Dutch sent troops to retake Indonesia. Initially, they're successful. They retake Saigon. They retake much of the south. America is aiding France's efforts here. They give them $500 million in aid over a 9-year period, and $500 million is a lot of money in 1945. But successful guerrilla tactics and a decline in support by the French public lead the French to lead Vietnam. And as we can see in The Quiet American, they are getting to the point where they're realizing that the war is unwinnable. So why is America involved? So, in a nutshell, after World War I, America followed a policy of isolationism. You know, they got involved in the First World War, and their politicians said, we shouldn't be getting involved in wars to do with Europe. We should keep ourselves isolated. And this fails very badly because obviously World War II happens. America gets involved in World War II. And so at the end of World War II, America realizes it needs to take a more active role in world affairs. And unlike the rest of the world, America comes out of World War II much, much stronger than at the start of the war. They actually double their GDP during the Second World War. So America comes out of World War II as a superpower. And as well, America has a certain vision for the world in 1945 that they want to project. So America's always claimed that it's against colonialism and empires. Okay, remember that America had been part of the British Empire and had fought for its independence. And this is a cartoon of England and the British Empire, and, you know, England is some sort of octopus who's got its tentacles everywhere, all over the world. And an example of this is that America put very, very heavy pressure on the Dutch to recognize Indonesian independence in 1949. So America is against colonialism. They think the idea of having an empire is bad. However, America also hates communism and is determined to contain communism. Because one of the prevailing theories in the Department of Defense in America post-1945 is the domino theory. So they were worried that if one country in Southeast Asia became communist, then its neighbors would follow, and they would become communist, and soon you would have this spread of communism across Southeast Asia into Latin America, and that would threaten the United States. And already by this time, in 1949, China becomes a communist country. Mao Zedong wins the Chinese Civil War. So now you have China and the USSR that are communist. The Americans feel threatened by this. And in Vietnam, the Viet Minh gain large support. And in Indonesia, the PKI are gaining large support. So America is worried about this. They want to contain communism. Some interesting information about General Tay. So General Tay, real life character, he was a Vietnamese general who formed his own militia to fight the Viet Minh and the French. So he's fighting the French, he's also fighting the Viet Minh at the same time. And his men are suspected of a series of terror attacks in Saigon that were blamed on the communists. Very similar to the book. And there is this character in real life called Edward Lansdale. So he was a CIA officer in Saigon, and he specialized in covert missions against American enemies. And I use enemies in inverted commas. And General Tay is persuaded by Lansdale to cooperate with America in 1954. So this means that Green probably didn't base pile on Lansdale, because this book was written before 1954. But General Tay was assassinated in 1955 by an unknown assailant, possibly Viet Minh. But Lansdale's memoirs were called The Unquiet American, because so many people were convinced that he was based on the Quiet American. And last but not least, let's look at the British post-World War II. So this is the British Empire at its peak, and although Britain had been victorious in World War II, the conflict had left the country absolutely broke. The gold reserves run out, and a number of its colonies wanted independence. So Britain won the war, but it was quite clear the country was in a bad state. social reform at home was a much more pressing concern. The British people wanted social reform. They wanted things like the National Health Service, which was set up in 1945. And gradually in the years after the war that you see most British colonies are given independence. Basically, once the British government can establish that a new government can be set up that isn't going to be communist, they gradually give independence to its colonies. So, for example, in 1947, India, which was always the sort of the most valued possession of Britain's empire, gains independence. Palestine does in 1947, which sets off, lots of problems in the Middle East. One of the reasons, anyway. And so, by 1945, the British Empire had 700 million people, and by 1965, it's 5 million. So the British Empire shrinks, and Britain's place as the sort of most powerful country in the world, with the biggest empire, is gone. Okay, so I hope that this video will be useful if you're making your timeline and you want to go over stuff again.